Hello, I'm glad you're here to join me today as we begin to look at Philippians chapter 1 today. Now, Philippians is a letter that was written by the Apostle Paul to the church at Philippi. And when Paul wrote this letter, he was in prison. He was in prison awaiting a trial. And he did not know the outcome of that trial. He could potentially be acquitted and released, or he could have potentially been condemned and put to death. And he didn't know what the outcome was going to be, but he did want to seize the opportunity to write the church at Philippi and to be an encouragement to them. And we see that as Paul wrote this letter, he had spent a great deal of time pondering the possibilities that lie before him. Would he die? Or would he live? And he spent time weighing the pros and cons of each of these possible outcomes. And as we reach verse 21, we find Paul beginning to explicitly express what he had spent some time pondering before. He said this, "For to me, to live is Christ." What on earth does that mean? He's going to define it in a minute. But to live is Christ, and to die is gain. In other words, Paul is in a win-win situation. If he lives, that is Christ. We'll define that in a moment. But even if he dies, even if he loses his life because of his allegiance to Jesus, even then, he will gain. He said this, "If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me." So what does it mean to live is Christ? What does Paul mean by that statement? He means fruitful labor. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that he's going to get to continue to do the things Jesus would do if Jesus was present. And that was fruitful labor, that he is going to continue to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. He's going to continue to spend time with believers in teaching them how to follow Jesus. So if he goes on living in the body, it will mean fruitful labor for him. What shall I choose? Of course, Paul realizes he's not necessarily going to get to choose, but if he could choose, what do I choose? He said, "I do not know." It's a conundrum. In fact, he said, "I'm torn between the two. I'm pulled between both possibilities, both scenarios, because living sounds great, but dying still is, well, gain." He said, "I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far." In other words, Paul believed that if he died, he would be with Christ. He never really offers much explanation as to what that means. In fact, Paul never ever says in any of his letters anything about going to heaven or going to heaven after you die or anything like that. This is the closest he maybe gets to an idea such as that, but he never says that here. He says, "I desire to depart and be with Christ," that somehow in his death he would be with Christ, which he said is better by far. But he said, "But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body." It would be beneficial to the Philippian believers if Paul lived and was able to engage in more fruitful labor amongst them. He said, "Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith." He believed, at least during this moment he believed, that ultimately he would be acquitted and that he'd be able to rejoin the Philippian believers and that he would get to continue in their progress in the faith. He said, "So that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me." But we get to what Paul has been driving at the whole time. Paul speaks of life and death and the possible scenario of departing and being with Christ or rejoining the believers. A lot of what he's trying to do here and what he's trying to accomplish is he's trying to help the Philippian believers to be resolute and to be bold and to be fearless. Why? Well, their leader is in jail. If my leader is in prison, if my leader is awaiting a trial before Caesar, I could very well become very anxious and wonder what the future holds, not just for him, but Well, for me as well, it'd be a scary situation to be in. And so Paul needs to direct the Philippians how to respond emotionally, physically, spiritually, etc. How to respond to the predicament that Paul is in. And so Paul helps them to understand that whether in life or death, Paul cannot lose. After all, they killed Jesus and he resurrected from the dead. The despotic powers that were displayed by Pilate and by the leaders in Jerusalem had no hold over Jesus, because Jesus defeated even death itself, which is the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of any despot. And so Paul was fearless. Does that mean that he was never emotionally distraught or concerned about what's going on? Well, in his letter to the Corinthians, he talked about how depressed he grew as he spent time in prison and didn't know the final outcome. So did he become depressed sometimes? Yes. Did he retain his faith throughout? Yes. Did he continue to be bold throughout? Yes. So Paul continued to be resolute, even though at times he was discouraged and even depressed. He was human just like you and me. But Paul said this: whatever happens, that is, whether I live or whether I die, he said, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Again, what is the gospel of Christ? The gospel of Christ is the proclamation that Jesus is the world's rightful king. And so the Philippians are to live as though Jesus is the world's true king, because Jesus is, in fact, the world's true king. He said, so then whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm. That is, that you continue to be resolute, that you continue to believe that Jesus is the world's rightful king, that you continue to live as though Jesus is the world's rightful king. You'll stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. So the believers were to stand unified and following Jesus as their king, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. Paul's saying, hey, I'm not frightened, and I'm even in jail and facing death. Therefore, you do not need to be frightened. He said, in fact, that this unity among the believers at Philippi would be a sign to them that they will be destroyed. It would be a sign to those who oppose them. They will be destroyed, but you, Paul said, will be saved. And that by God. You will be rescued. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. For this is what it means to give our allegiance to Jesus. Not only to acknowledge that he's the king and to believe that he's the king, but to follow him as the king, and that entails suffering with him. You want to mimic his story like Paul is, like we've been called to do? Part of Jesus' story is suffering for doing what is right. He said, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. Paul's saying, look, I see that you are struggling just like I am. Here's how I'm dealing with it. Here's how you can deal with it too. Paul was resolute. Did he become discouraged sometimes? Yes, of course. But he said that whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a worthy manner. Conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. To live is Christ. That means fruitful labor with and for Jesus. And even in the face of death, hey, even that's gain, because to depart is to be with Christ. We hold on to these words of hope today. God bless you and go with God.